Transportista is a podcast that looks into the story of a mysterious pilot who spoke to us using a clandestine cell phone from inside a prison in North Carolina and claims to have worked in the international drug trade for some 30 years.
I'm Transportista. That's what I am.
He is also a man obsessed with telling and selling his own story. My name is John Gibler. This is Transportista. Listen to Transportista starting July 14 on iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Forgotten is a production of iHeartMedia and Unusual Productions.
Before we start, this podcast contains accounts which some listeners will find disturbing, but without them, the story can't be fully understood. Please take care while listening.
A couple of years ago, I went to El Paso, Texas, because I was making a documentary about the US-Mexico border. While I was there, I asked one of the producers a question. I said, if you could tell any story about this place, what would it be? He told me that right across the border from where we stood, there were young women who worked in American-owned factories in the Mexican city of Ciudad Juárez, and they were being killed with horrific brutality. The victims were often found half-naked, dumped in the desert. Some were found in mass graves with strange symbols left on their bodies. The producer told me there were all kinds of theories about what was happening to the women, but that no one knew for sure. So I asked him if I could interview him on the record, and he thought about it and said no. It was too dangerous. But others did speak, and it became clear that the deaths, the disappearances of these women, they aren't random. They seem to follow a pattern.
You'd have women or girls, even 15, 17, 19.
And they have a similar look.
Slim, dark skin, dark hair,
Which suggests they may have been selected.
All from poor families, all from mostly poor neighborhoods.
They hold the same types of jobs.
Usually students, factory workers.
And commute regularly, alone, on public buses through downtown Juarez. And then, they're never seen again. At least, not alive. I quickly realized I'd never be able to understand the depth and complexity of this story without a partner. I asked a friend if they knew anyone who might be prepared to work with me. And it turned out they knew the perfect person.
In the first 3 weeks of 2020, there have been more murders in Juarez than days in the new year, when a crush of Central American families has overwhelmed officials at the southern border.
We're going down to the basement where other migrants are hanging out at this hotel.
There's a horrific history of violence against women in Ciudad Juárez. In the last 3 decades, hundreds of women have been brutally murdered here. Many of their cases remain unsolved.
And that's how I first got to know my co-host, Mónica, a reporter from El Paso, a regular voice on public radio, and an authority on the region. Together, we'll explore who is responsible for the deaths of so many women in Juarez and why the crimes have remained unsolved for decades. I'm Woloshyn.
And I'm Mónica Ortiz Uribe.
This is Forgotten.
The Women of Juárez.
Voy a crear un canto para poder existir, para mover la tierra a los hombres y sobrevivir. Yo no nací sin causa, yo no nací sin fe. Mi corazón pega fuerte para gritar a los que no sienten, así perseguir a la felicidad.
I've always been fascinated by borders, and something about El Paso called to me long before I ever went there. It was this city of several 100,000 people in the desert, surrounded by mountains, whose name literally means the pass. Right across the dry bed of the Rio Grande River, separated by a 20-foot metal fence, is El Paso's twin city, Ciudad Juárez. When you drive along the highway in El Paso, the barrier becomes a brown blur of rusted metal. But if you stop and look, you can see right through the slats. In Juárez, there's a cathedral originally built by Spanish colonialists. There's the Kentucky Club, a bar that claims to have invented the margarita and that traces its name to the city's history of whiskey distilling and smuggling during Prohibition. There are huge, colorful murals celebrating local legends like the musician Juan Gabriel. And for all the things you read about the cartel violence, the desert landscape has a stark beauty. And Juárez is chaotic and bustling, a city of over 1 million people and a city of dreams. People come here to find education, to find work. I had come here because I wanted to know what living on this divide meant. But then I heard about the women, young women who've been going missing and turning up dead since the 1990s, often dumped in the desert. At first, the authorities tried to claim the murders were random and individual. But then, in 1995, the first mass grave was discovered in a place called Lote Bravo. 9 women's bodies were discovered in this deserted plot of land, not far from the airport. The bodies were strewn around as if the killer hadn't even made an effort to hide them. Some of the victims had their hands tied with shoelaces. Others had a severed left breast. One had a triangle carved on her back. Who could be capable of this? Speculations ran from a satanic cult to a serial killer. Then, in 1996, another mass grave was discovered. And then another, and another, and another. The most recent was in 2012. These were crimes that shocked people in both cities, and that made it clear how powerfully a border can shape a person's fate. I needed to know more, so I sent Mónica an email to ask if she'd consider working with me. And, well, I received a cool reception.
I was very guarded at the beginning because, this is a story that I hold close to my heart, and I was very hesitant to work with anybody I didn't know, with a stranger. Yeah. I just presumed you were a gringo, even though you're not quite a gringo. I don't know. For us border ladies, I suppose, we're naturally suspicious of gringos coming in from the outside, telling the most sensitive story of our careers. The story takes an incredible emotional toll on you, and you're suffering all this distress because of it. So much so that I was ready to walk away. But then I get this email.
So what made you agree to work on this together?
Well, honestly, because I've got this conscience that's eating away at me and won't let me go. When I started reporting in Juárez, there was one day when I was getting into the car, my mom followed me into the garage and got into the passenger seat with me. And she said, if you're going to go over there and put yourself in danger, then I'm going to go over there and put myself in the same danger. I can't let you go and expose yourself alone.
Wow.
That moment really forced me to grapple with, what are you willing to give up for this story? The Juárez that I knew growing up is not the Juárez that exists today. It's really sad, but today I think twice before I go to Juárez because of the dangers. So why did I let you pull me back in? Well, because I identify so strongly with the victims. There are women there that look like me, that are my same age, but confront a completely different, horrific reality.
The border between El Paso and Juárez is increasingly militarized, but the line between the two cities has always been porous. Every year, millions of people cross back and forth over the 3 bridges that connect them. For this reason, it wasn't long before the murders of the women in Juárez made it onto the radar of the FBI's El Paso office.
It strikes the heart when you see women being left like they're garbage.
That's Hardrick Crawford Jr. speaking. He was the FBI special agent in charge of El Paso from 2001 to 2003. He first learned about the crimes when he was preparing for his assignment at the FBI's headquarters.
You look at the newspaper clips, and one of the things that jumped out at me was the murder of women in Juárez. To me, it's a crime on the level of the war crimes in Bosnia and Croatia, ethnic cleansing. It hit me on a personal level, more so than it did on a professional level. It'll sound funny, but I thought, okay, now I know why God sent me to El Paso. This was the reason I was sent here.
Nowadays, Hardrick lives in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. The day we pay him a visit, he's taking care of his grandchildren. But he was once one of the country's top law enforcement agents.
Protecting the realm.
He spent years investigating some of the world's most dangerous criminal networks.
Bad guys, evildoers.
He went undercover to bust Colombian organized crime in Miami.
While wearing a recorder. That was kind of dicey.
In 1998, he set up the FBI's command post in Nairobi, Kenya, after Osama bin Laden bombed the embassy there.
I was a senior man in the continent.
But the assignment that he can't stop thinking about is El Paso, Texas.
Just the sheer number of women was alarming. That the most unsettling fact was the lack of tracking or information gathered as to the number of women when they occurred, their modus operandi, what were the women doing? No database.
The lack of official data presented Hardrick with a concrete problem. In fact, at least 6 of the murdered women in Juárez were US citizens. And meanwhile, there was a letter to the editor of the El Paso Times in 2002 suggesting that the number of sex offenders paroled to the city from elsewhere had become a crisis. Could they have been drawn by the proximity to the border and the possibility of crossing back and forth into Mexico? Well, in this binational community, a big part of Hardrick's responsibility was solving binational crimes.
If you look out of your office at the FBI, you could see Juárez. In downtown El Paso driving, you could see Juárez. It's there. It's looming large.
Shortly after he arrives at the border, a chilling hypothesis about who might be killing the women begins to take hold. Here's Hardrick giving an interview to ABC News in 2001.
There is a real possibility that an American or someone who is residing on our side of the border is conducting these murders.
Hardrick goes on to describe Juárez as a killing field for young women.
We discussed the fact that it would be easy for an El Paso-based predator to walk across the border every day, commit a terrible crime, and then come back to El Paso and live a life with nobody to be the wiser. I mean, if you've ever been to Juárez, disposing of bodies is real easy. You don't have to dig through hard dirt. You're digging through sand.
Juárez is surrounded by desert. Law enforcement is under-resourced, and you can walk there from El Paso in a matter of minutes. All of this was on Hardrick's mind when he worried that it could be a hunting ground for an American serial killer. And there was something else too. Juárez was a city of migrants, young women and their families who had moved from rural Mexico to this industrial metropolis, drawn by the many factories or maquiladoras. And they didn't always have people to look out for them.
It was like a perfect storm. You have the women coming from southern Mexico, from Central America, desperate for work to help their families to come work at the maquiladoras. They're alone. The flip side of the coin is you'd have to be a cretin if you're a serial murderer or you're a psychopath, not to understand, wow, it's like antelopes at the waterhole. What a great opportunity for a serial killer. Once you start focusing on Juárez and El Paso, you can't miss it. Diana Valdez was writing about it.
Diana Washington Valdez is the reporter who has gone deeper into this story than perhaps any other. She wrote the defining book on the topic called The Killing Fields, Harvest of Women. And she noticed something that Hardrick Crawford picked up on about how the killer selected their victims. When we come back, Diana tells us what she pieced together.
I'm Malcolm Gladwell, and I've got to warn you. The new season of my podcast, Revisionist History, is completely unbound. We're finally out of the house. And now that we've got the chance, we're going into the streets and even under the sea, all in the name of continuing this journey through the overlooked and misunderstood. Our episodes take on autonomous cars, dirty laundry, college rankings, and fairy tales. In quarantine, I finally watched The Little Mermaid, and I was shocked. It's rife with moral conundrums. Can it be saved? With the help of Jodie Foster, Britt Marling, and Dax Shepard, we attempt an epic de-Disneyfying of a Disney classic. I haven't decided who we rile up most, college presidents or Disney executives. You'll have to hear for yourself. Listen to Revisionist History on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I didn't think about the danger in the beginning, probably intentionally, because if I focused on the danger, then I would immediately create a barrier for myself to hold me back. It was not unusual to find myself in Juárez at 11, 12 p.m., 1 a.m., in order to interview certain police officers who were getting off their shift and had agreed to share confidentially what they knew.
So, Mónica, if you ask anybody from the area about these crimes, the name they mention is Diana Washington Valdez. Who is she?
Yeah, so Diana, like me, is a reporter. She was born in Mexico, raised in El Paso, and spent most of her career at the El Paso Times. And when I did a college internship at the El Paso Times, Diana was one of my first teachers in journalism.
And what was your first impression of Diana when you met her in the office?
I saw her as a badass, so much so that I felt intimidated the first time I met her and put my hand out to shake hers. And she just laughed it off and said, no, don't be intimidated. I'm here for whatever you need. I think part of also what helped her reporting in Juárez is this stern exterior, this discipline that comes with military training.
And what exactly did Diana do in the military?
She served in the Army and then the National Guard for a total of 20 years.
Wow.
And that training and the discipline that comes with it helped her with her reporting. In the scariest moments, she says her training would kick in and help her set her emotions aside and focus on the mission before her.
So we went to pay Diana a visit at her home in El Paso, near the foot of the Franklin Mountains, some distance north of the border.
There's your hot water for tea in the cups.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. How nice.
Diana welcomes us into her home with a generosity and warmth that belies a tough exterior.
Here's the sugar.
We were there to learn what her reporting on connections between the murders in Juárez might reveal about who was committing them. As we settled around her coffee table, I was curious about what had made Diana connect so deeply to this story.
When I was a young woman, I could have been one of the victims because of my look and the long hair and wandering around Juárez naively. When I was 18 and 19, they're my compatriots. I'm part of them. They're part of me. Never in a million years I could imagine writing about teenage girls who were brutally murdered and whose deaths are unsolved, and all of this could have been prevented. I never would have imagined it. So.
As a reporter at the El Paso Times, Diana started to notice a pattern of young women in Juárez disappearing and turning up dead. It was a golden age of local journalism, and she had the platform to shine a light on these unsolved murders, and perhaps in doing so, prevent more. But first she had to figure out exactly what was going on.
We kept seeing reports about X number of bodies found, another woman found dead, mutilated, very horrific murders. The brutality, it was something we've never seen here on the border on either side. But what I had been reading in the Mexican press did not tell me who was killing the women and why. So I got involved in investigating the murders.
When was the very first time when you thought there's something connecting these crimes?
The fact that multiple bodies were left in specific sites, in sites where the bodies could be found. This was unseen and unheard of. In some cases, we had what I call a sense of overkill, because we would have a victim, for example, that was strangled, stabbed, and shot. Also, these strangulations, the medical examiners in Juárez noted were for the purposes of sexual gratification of the perpetrator. The women were being strangled to achieve this kind of sexual effect.
It seemed that whoever was killing the women in Juárez was not content merely to end their lives. It seemed they wanted to completely dehumanize them in the process. But who would want to do this? And why? It seemed like whoever it was taunting investigators, purposefully leaving signatures at the crime scenes.
Yet the symbols that law enforcement found on some of the victims were very intriguing. These were linked to possible serial killers. And we know that serial killers have their own rituals in the way that they kill the victims and the way they position their bodies and the trophies they might take from them. And in several cases, these triangles were carved on the backs of the victims. Those characteristics were terrifying to people and to the families, because they would look at it and say, it's not just a murder, there's something else going on here. It's scary.
Did you ever discover what that something else was?
There were, there were just speculations. There were only speculations. The markings might have indicated the initials of a perpetrator or represented a map,
A map?
Mm-hmm. A map.
Of what?
A map of murder, Mm-hmm.
Geographical map, topographical?
Geographical map. That's as far as I was able to ascertain the information was provided.
Could this possibly be true? A map of murder left on the bodies of the victims? And if so, where does that map lead? Well, despite a full plate of assignments in El Paso from her editors, those questions sent Diana into Juárez on her evenings, weekends, and even vacation to answer.
I know just from experience that someone always knows something. Someone knows what's going on. These murders appear to be taking place systematically. It's specific kinds of victims are being selected and kidnapped or taken by force somehow or lured, and then their bodies found.
Diana was struck by the profile of the victims. They were young. They'd come from elsewhere in search of opportunity, and they seemed to disappear into thin air without witnesses. Standing at a memorial erected by the parents of one of the murdered women, Lilia Alejandra Andrade, Diana was momentarily overwhelmed.
I walked through that field where her body had been found, and I saw the cross, Lilia Alejandra Andrade, and it kind of just all hit me at once that this is where a young lady's life was snuffed out mercilessly. And it's just like all the emotions that I had suppressed up to then about the victims, just the dam burst. And I started sobbing uncontrollably. I couldn't stop. It just happened. And I cried and I cried and I cried. And the people who walked by saw me and, they thought something was wrong. And I couldn't tell them.
Mónica, you're nodding.
I had a similar moment where the tears came, and it was something that I couldn't stop, and I was surprised at myself. And the grief builds up on you.
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, you think about the helplessness of the victims. Look at what they were up against. You're 16, 17-year-old. You went downtown to do an errand for your parents or to try on some new shoes, to apply for a job, and whoosh, you're grabbed and lured and you're murdered.
Diana and Hardrick established a clear pattern in what type of victims the killer would target and how they would kill them. And in fact, there are so many murders of young women in Juárez that fit this pattern that the reflex can be to retreat into statistics. This many women, that cause of death. But you can't understand the full situation without getting to know some of the victims. Victims like Sagrario González Flores. Early on, when we were embarking on this story together, Mónica, you mentioned Sagrario González.
Sagrario González's story is the story of so many other women who were murdered in Ciudad Juárez. She was an immigrant. She was a factory worker. She was a teenager. She went missing between her home and her work. And her murder transformed her family's life into this fight to try to find out what happened.
But who is she?
So, she sang in the church choir and taught Sunday school to kindergartners. She has a boyfriend. His name is Andres. She's got a notebook where she writes poetry. She puts all kinds of stickers in this notebook, like hearts and princesses and rabbits. And her handwriting is impeccable, written in block print, very neat. And it's clear she's sweet on Andres, too. She's got his name and phone number written on the front cover.
And what was it like looking into that book?
Oh, gosh, how do you describe that? This is like a relic of someone who's gone. It's the closest thing to her. I mean, it's so precious just to see her name on there, her own name written in her own handwriting. I don't have the words for it. But she's the whole reason why I'm sticking around to tell the story.
Sagrario González Flores was one of 6 sisters, and she was 17 years old when she left for work at 4 a.m. on Thursday, April 16th, 1998. She arrived at the factory, completed her normal workday, and then left to take the bus home. But she never made it. Her body was discovered 2 weeks later, dumped in the desert on the other side of town from where she lived. When we come back, we travel to Juárez to meet Sagrario's mother, Paula, at her home to learn more about her search for answers.
Pee-wee Gaskins Was Not My Friend is a new true crime podcast from iHeartRadio and Doghouse Pictures.
He just killed whatever he wanted to when he wanted to.
Pee-wee manipulated one unwitting accessory into aiding him with his final murder.
But it didn't take much to find out the truth about him.
Listen and follow Pee-wee Gaskins Was Not My Friend on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Driving into Mexico from El Paso is straightforward. Passports are rarely checked, and most cars are waved through. I now understood firsthand what Hardrick meant about how easy it would be for an American citizen to slip back and forth across the border. The part of Juárez closest to the bridge from the United States has restaurants with neglected facades from the 50s. There's a strip of nightclubs and bars, and there are billboards in English advertising cosmetic dentistry. But as you drive west, towards the Flores household, paved streets begin to give way to dirt roads, and urban infrastructure turns to desert.
The Flores family lives in a colonia or neighborhood called Lomas de Poleo. It's one of the first communities in Mexico that isn't separated from the U.S. by the Rio Grande. That river travels south from New Mexico, then takes a sharp turn east when it reaches Texas, and that's where it becomes the U.S.-Mexico border. West of that point, the landscape is mostly desert, so nothing to divide the two countries, but a series of man-made barriers, each more severe than the last. Lomas de Poleo began as a squatter community founded by migrant families from other parts of Mexico, and most of them came here to work in the maquiladoras.
As we drive through Lomas de Poleo, we pass house after house, each seemingly constructed from different materials. There are few street names and no street lights. Paula's house is one of the more substantial in the neighborhood, and it has a gated dirt yard where we park. We get an extremely warm welcome when we arrive at Paula's house, from dogs to neighborhood children to Paula herself.
Mi nombre es Paula Flores Bonilla.
My name is Paula Flores Bonilla. We are at my house, which is also yours, here in Lomas de Poleo.
Paula has this cascade of thick black hair almost to her waist, and her wardrobe is very feminine. She carries herself with dignity and pride. Her shoulders are back, her head is held high. Paula is like the nucleus of her household. She's without a doubt the matriarch in the family.
Bueno, nosotros venimos del estado de Durango, del Salto de Pueblo Nuevo Durango. Llegamos.
Voy a traducir un poquito. So she is just telling us about where her family came from.
En Durango, en El Salto.
In El Salto, Durango, where we lived, my husband Jesus worked in the mountains. He was a chainsaw operator, chopping pine trees for wood. In fact, in Durango, that's what most people do for work. My sister-in-law already lived here, and she was the one who invited us, saying that there was a lot of work here. We didn't bring a whole lot. We had what we were wearing and one change of clothing. The truck we were in had a camper bed, so in the back, on top of a camper, we packed 4 chairs. Inside the camper were my daughters, who lay on a little mattress, along with a bin of dishes. That's all we brought.
It was 1995, a year after NAFTA was signed, and free trade meant the factories were booming. To this day, companies like General Electric and Johnson & Johnson create things like medical gloves and blood pressure cuffs in Juárez for export to the US. But Juárez had done little to prepare for the arrival of migrants like Paula, her husband Jesus, and their daughter Sagrario. That's how neighborhoods like Lomas de Poleo came into existence. And to get the materials they needed to build their life, many families salvaged scrap from US dumps across the border. This was at a time when the border was much less harshly enforced.
Well, our primary need was wood because we wanted to put a roof over our heads to live, right?
It wasn't unusual for people who lived in Lomas de Poleo to crawl under or jump over this barbed wire fence, get to this American landfill on the other side, and pick through it to find material to construct their homes.
There were a few times that Sagrario accompanied us to the American landfill. One of those times, it was in December, and we were there, and some guys came to throw out trash, right? So one of the guys saw her and noticed she was cold, so he took off his jacket and gave it to her. Sagrario was pale, and her face turned bright red, and she told him, no, thank you. And I told her, it's okay, take it. And Sagrario was blushing. She went over and took it, even though she didn't want to, and he gave it to her. That moment always stuck with me.
Despite having to build the roof above their own heads, the Flores family did find what they'd come in search of: work.
Jesus and 4 of his kids, including Sagrario, worked the evening shift at the same maquila making refrigerator parts. They traveled as a group to and from work. Then the factory found out that Sagrario was underage. She was 17. So she was told that in order to keep working, she would have to switch to the day shift. And if she did that, she would have to wake up before dawn and make the 2-hour bus trip to work alone.
When they made the change, I told her to wait instead of accepting it. April, May, June, July. On July 31st, she would turn 18. I said to her, when you turn 18, you can go with your daddy and Guille, right? She said no, but she wanted to help, that she needed the money to support our home.
So every morning, Sagrario would wake up at 3 a.m. She'd lower her bare feet onto a square of loose carpet that was placed on the dirt floor of their home. And next to the bed, there was a chair with her clothes folded on top of it and 20 Mexican pesos, bus fare to get from home to work.
My son Chuy would go and walk her to the number 10 bus, and then in downtown, she would take another bus to work. When they changed her shift, she signed an insurance policy, like with beneficiaries, in case something happens. I remember that when she arrived with that paperwork, she said to me, Mama, they're going to give me life insurance in the maquila. Joking around, she told me, if something happens to me, Mama, they're going to give you a ton of money. I said, don't go saying that, honey. Why do you say that to me? Yes, Mama, if something happens to me, the maquila will give you lots of money. I always remember that so vividly. I don't know if my innocent girl had a feeling that something was going to happen to her. I don't know.
The Flores family moved to Juárez in 1995, the very same year that the first mass grave of women was discovered. Paula's husband Jesus had moved to Juárez with their son Chuy before the rest of the family, and Jesus sent letters home to Durango encouraging Paula and their 6 daughters to join. Paula read them aloud to us.
My Paula, I want to tell you the following. My love, we are in luck. As soon as we arrived, we found work. I asked him, how's the neighborhood? Whether it was peaceful because I'd heard it was dangerous in Juárez. And he said, no, it's peaceful. It's a new neighborhood. All the people are just getting started. I told him, they say they kill women there. They kill girls. And he said, no. I said, it's just that we're bringing a lot, 6 daughters. And he said, no, there's no danger.
Within 3 years of arriving with big dreams of a brighter future, Paula's worst fears had been realized. Sagrario had been brutally murdered.
So people often ask me, what's the most difficult story you've had to cover as a reporter? And my answer is always the same: the missing and murdered women of Juárez. It's a story that I've come back to throughout my career. I was once at a gathering of activists outside a courthouse in Juárez, and I remember this girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old. She was singing a song called Derecho de Nacimiento, or Birthright. It was in memory of the slain women. Women like Sagrario González Flores, Lilia Alejandra Andrade, and Guadalupe Pérez Montes. I once made a silent promise to these women that I would tell the world who they were and why they mattered, so that they would never be forgotten. In Juárez, these crimes have gone on for so long that this most extreme form of violence against women has a name: feminicidio, femicide.
And the crimes have been maddeningly hard to solve. Witnesses rarely come forward. Evidence goes missing. Police are overstretched. But then, in 2001, a case came along that had all the pieces in place to be solved and to uncover who was behind the rest of these murders. That's in our next episode. I'm Woloshyn.
And I'm Mónica Ortiz Uribe. See you next time.
Yo no nací sin causa. Yo no nací sin fe. Mi corazón pega fuerte para gritar a los que no sienten así perseguir a la felicidad.
Forgotten, The Women of Juárez is co-hosted by me, Mónica Ortiz Uribe.
And me, Woloshyn.
We'd like to thank Paula Flores and all the victims' families. And thank you to Diana Washington Valdez and all the truth seekers and activists who fight for justice. And to the many people you won't hear on tape who contributed to this podcast. Thank you to Natalia Lafourcade and Queta Calderón for their help with our theme song, Derecho de Nacimiento.
Forgotten is executive produced by me, Woloshyn, and Mangesh Hatigera. Our producers are Julia Mueller and Katrina Norvell. Sound editing by Julia Mueller and Jacopo Penzo. Lucas Riley is our story editor. Caitlin Thompson is our consulting producer. Production support from Emily Marinoff and Aaron Kaufman. Recording assistance this episode from Melissa Kaplan. Music by Leonardo Heiblum and Jacobo Lieberman. Additional music by Aaron Kaufman. Carla Tassara is the voice actor for Paula Flores. Special thanks to Angela Kocherga for introducing me to Mónica, to Weird Move West for exceptional production support in El Paso, and to Jonah Descent for executive producing Bridging Us, the documentary series that first brought me to the border.
This podcast is dedicated to all the women lost to senseless violence in Juárez and all around the world. Esta serie se dedica a todas las mujeres que han sufrido bajo la violencia. Ni una más.
On the Haunted Road podcast, join Amy Bruni, star of the hit TV show Ghost Hunters, for a guided tour of America's most haunted locations and hear from the expert paranormal investigators who've experienced these places firsthand.
You'll be in the building all alone and you'll hear conversations down the hallways. It'll be more than one person. When you're in that building, it just really feels like something's just standing over your shoulder.
Listen to Haunted Road with Amy Bruni on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.